Welcome. We're going to get started with some introductions. Thank you for coming out tonight for our conversation that's part of our Beyond the Page series. This series, we've had 2 conversations so far. We have another on the way. This series invites guest authors and publishing professionals to discuss craft and issues that go beyond craft and explore topics such as race, identity, culture, authenticity, and what it means to write within and outside of our own experiences. Tonight's conversation will discuss writing that dares to defy artistic and social norms, writing that pushes back against constraints of gender, genre, history, and social cultural expectations. We are thrilled to be able to offer ASL interpretation tonight, and a huge thanks to our interpreters, Meryl Troop and Mike Lentine. It's also worth noting that tonight's conversation is in part made possible by a grant from Maine Humanities Council. We'd also like to do a land acknowledgement and recognize that we are inhabiting the homeland of the Wabanaki, people of the Dawn, who are still here living, creating, and caring for this land and water. The space we work and live in is unceded Wabanaki territory. Recognizing and naming this is one small step towards correcting narratives and practices that have denied the vitality of Wabanaki history and culture for generations. We owe a debt of gratitude to the Wabanaki people for tending to and sharing this land and water, and we respect and are committed to building reciprocal relationships with Maine's Indigenous people, tribes, and communities. A little bit about the format of tonight's event. As soon as I'm done with this introduction, you'll see 7 squares up on your screen, and we're doing it that way so that folks can have access to the ASL interpretation at all times. This conversation will last for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&As. At any time, feel free to put your questions into the chat. And I will also include a link in the chat box as we get going to Print Bookstore, one of our awesome independent bookstores in Maine. Jenn and Elissa both have books that are out and relatively new. And so this link will take you to a page where you can purchase them. And also thanks to you guys for being here, because I know we are all exhausted by Zoom and the weather is starting to get nicer, but this is going to be a really great conversation tonight, and I'm super excited about it and have been for a while. Now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our 2 Maine Lit fellows who have spearheaded this series and who it's been such a blessing to be able to work with. Samaa Abdurraqib lives in Portland with her cat, Stashel Hammett, resident charmer and most attractive feline in the world, she claims, but it must be true. She enjoys birding, hiking, and being outdoors and coaching leaders of color. She is an outdoor Afro leader in Portland, Maine, and has been connecting with Black people in the outdoors for over 3 years. Samaa also loves writing and has recently returned to writing poetry and creative nonfiction after a 15-year hiatus. She's recently published her first chapbook, Each Day is Like an Anchor. She is the Associate Director at Maine Humanities Council. Our second Maine Lit Fellow is Morgan Talty. He's a citizen of the Penobscot Indian Nation where he grew up. He received his BA in Native American Studies from Dartmouth College and his MFA in fiction from Stone Coast Slow Residency Program. His story collection, Night of the Living Res, is forthcoming from Tin House Books. His work has appeared in the Georgia Review, Shenandoah, Tri-Quarterly, Narrative Magazine, Lit Hub, and elsewhere. He is a writing consultant and a college instructor who teaches courses in both English and Native American Studies. And now to introduce our 3 distinguished panelists. We are so lucky to have them here, which is one of the pleasures of this year in Zoom, is being able to connect with folks who are perhaps many states away. Ian Khara Ellasante is a Black, queer, trans, non-binary poet and cultural studies scholar, winner of the 49th New Millennium Award for Poetry. Ian Khara's poems have appeared in We Want It All, an anthology of radical trans poetics, The Feminist Wire, The Volta, Hinch's Deep Poesia, and elsewhere. With abiding affection for their hometown of Memphis, Ian Khara has also loved living and writing in Tucson, Brooklyn, and most recently in Southern Maine, where they are an assistant professor of gender and sexuality studies at Bates College. Next, Jenn Shapland is a writer and archivist living in New Mexico. Her first book, My Autobiography of Carson McCullers, was a finalist for the 2020 National Book Award and won a Lambda Literary Award and was longlisted for the 2021 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence. Her essay, Finders Keepers, won a 2017 Pushcart, and she was awarded the 2019 Rabkin Foundation Award for Art Journalism. She has a PhD in English from the University of Texas at Austin and is currently working on a collection of essays. And lastly, Elissa Washuta is a member of the Cowlitz Indian tribe and a nonfiction writer. She is the author of White Magic, My Body is a Book of Rules, and Starvation Mode. With Teresa Warburton, she is co-editor of the anthology Shapes of Native Nonfiction, collected essays by contemporary writers. She's a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship recipient, a Creative Capital awardee, and an assistant professor of creative writing at The Ohio State University. Welcome, all of you guys. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to turn it over to Samaa and Morgan.
Thanks, Taryn. Welcome, everyone. Good to see you all. I'm really, really excited about this panel. So I just want to say again, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. We'll be keeping our eye on the chat. We have a list of questions that we developed together with the panelists. But if we see some of the same questions coming up in the chat, we might interrupt our plan and ask that question. So please ask them. Drop them in the chat when you are so moved to do that. So we're going to start this panel, like we've started all the panels in this series thus far, with asking a question. What are you writing right now? Would anyone like to go first?
Here's the awkward silence we were talking about.
Yes.
I'll call Jenn, just because you're right above me.
Right now, I am writing an essay called Thin Skin, and it's involving a lot of research into histories of toxicity having to do with uranium mining and nuclear research in New Mexico, among other things. So I'm in a pretty dark research tunnel right now.
I'll go next and then I'll pick the next person. So I'm doing a lot of revision right now, but I'm also really into writing into certain kinds of poetic forms, and I've been writing a lot of poems that are a form called a bop, which is a very cool form that has this kind of refrain, and I've been using song lyrics for that refrain. And in my non-creative writing life and my work life, I'm writing grant applications and equity statements. Elissa, what are you writing?
I'm trying to figure out how to describe it. I'm working on a new project. The essays I've been interested in writing over the last year or so, not that I've written very much, but I've been interested in writing essays about living between apocalypses. The mid-1800s apocalypse of the Cascade and Cowlitz people, my ancestors, who were mostly killed by infectious disease, probably mostly malaria. And then, of course, the other, the following acts of genocide after settlers came all the way west. And then, thinking about all of the sort of thoughts and words about doomsday in the air fairly recently. So right now I'm working on something about my newest weird obsession has been following the movie The Big Short, I became very interested in the weirdness of the stock market. And so I'm working on something now that's pretty big, but I think a lot of it is about how the stock market and the economy generally seems like a sort of simulation of real life right now as it becomes more and more absurd. Ian, what are you working on?
Thank you. Yeah, so I've been working on some poems because it feels therapeutic right now. And alongside that, I've been doing some writing to just process through so much of what's been going on in the world, over these last, 14, 15 months. And a lot of just kind of personal stuff that's been going on. And I think like that kind of like daily medicinal therapeutic writing, I can tell like something really daring, I think, is going to emerge when I decide to look back over that. And in the meantime, I'm devising a larger project, so a book project that explores the nexus of Blackness and queerness and church life. So this is definitely going to be and is becoming a hybrid text. So merging poetry and life writing, really kind of exploring some experiences from my youth and scholarship. So that's what I've been up to. Morgan, what about you?
It was great to hear what people are like writing about. It's interesting, Elissa, you talk about apocalyptic, and I've sort of been drawn to that as well. I thought I was going to write a zombie novel, but it instead turned out to just be like this very strange short story. Because there's in Penobscot, there's no word for zombie. There's like a word naka, which means like the former or the living, but it doesn't necessarily mean somebody who's come back to life. So I was like playing with that, and I wrote this story about it. But I've been consumed with that idea about genocide and I guess doomsday too. But I also have a larger project that I'm working on called The Year of the Frog Clan, which is it's about 3 girls who are living with their aunt because their mother lost custody of them again for like the 10th time, I think. And it's about growing up in these weird spaces, and also is going to explore foster care systems with the state of Maine, because it has a deep history, just like all other tribes in the US. I'm just going to give a quick shout out to Dawnland, if you haven't seen it, which focuses on Wabanaki restoration. And I think it's on PBS for free, you can watch. So yeah, that's what I'm working on. All right. So I think we should get started then. I don't know, I just always get caught up with what people are writing about. I just want to like talk about it and really dive into stuff. But I want to welcome everybody here, and I want to thank Jenn, Elissa, and Ian for being with us tonight and joining us for this conversation on writing that dares. I thought I'd start with I guess maybe building a foundation upon which so we can have a conversation. And so I guess I'll ask, how would you define writing that dares, and what is it about your writing that you feel is daring or has felt daring? What risks have you taken in your own writing? And I think to avoid the awkward pauses, I'll call on Jenn again because she's right above me.
Sure. The more I think about this question, and I've been thinking about it since this, panel kind of came together, the more I feel like just about all writing is daring. Like the very fact of taking something that you felt or experienced or thought, and then like putting it out into the world is just an incredibly vulnerable thing to do. I'm sure that for some writers, for, I don't know, like Tom Clancy or something, at some point it's not that daring. Like at some point you're just churning something out. But it seems, especially when you're starting something new, like what everyone just described, their projects, which sound fantastic, or what Samaa described, coming back to writing after a break of 15 years, like that's an incredibly daring thing to do. And in a capitalist society, and in a society that values a very particular understanding of what work is, and in a society that values particular voices over other voices, especially to be writing from a marginalized position, that's just daring. But in my own writing, some of the risks have been a little bit more legal, have had to do with trying to write a biography of someone that kind of pushes against the biographies that are already in existence about her, and to try to articulate in language some truths about Carson McCullers' life and about her relationships with women, her understanding of her own sexuality, and having to write all of that and kind of come to that without having permission from the McCullers estate. So that was a really big risk. And you know, it felt risky to me to put something out there that I thought other people might push back against or disagree with, or somehow be offended by. And then also to kind of put myself on the page with her. All of that felt super, super risky. And in some ways it's paid off, and in some ways it's been really scary. But yeah, those are some of the risks that I've taken. What about you, Ian?
Well, thank you. So yeah, I've been thinking about this question a lot too since we met last week. And so I think transgressive was one of the terms that we tossed around last week. And so I've been thinking about writing that dares as transgressive. And I was reminded of a teacher I had once who said that it's important, or it's good to know the rules. So be they the rules of grammar or punctuation or forms of poetry, like a traditional sonnet or a villanelle or a sestina, so that it's good to know the rules, so that when you break the rules, you know what you're breaking and why you're breaking it. And I've been finding that is a really helpful starting point for me to think about how writing can dare. So if being daring is transgressive, then what are we transgressing in our writing, and why? Why are we transgressing it? Why are we making those choices? And I realize it's been a good practice for me to ask myself questions like that. And I've also realized that I've been equating daring here with risk, which I've been equating with vulnerability. And so when I think about how vulnerability, that type of risk-taking, shows up in my writing, I think about the Diana series of poetry that I've written and keep writing. And I think that's the most daring, vulnerable, risky writing that I've done. So I began this series back in 2013, which was about a year and a half or so into a gender transition for me. I was in such a liminal space, and found that I was really struggling to find a vehicle through which I could write about this really singular time in my life, but I really wanted to document it. It felt necessary to document it and try to take that risk. And I found that like I could speak to and through Diana, who at first just was kind of like the goddess figure Diana, who I kind of made my own in this way, but that I could speak to and through her as a symbol of womanhood, as my relationship to my own womanhood was shifting pretty drastically during that time. So with that vehicle, which kind of was like a buffer, really, I've been able to get pretty vulnerable in what I've been willing to explore about a trans and trans non-binary experience. I also found that I've been trying to take more risks and be more daring in terms of my dialect in my writing. So I'm a Black person raised in African-American vernacular English, which I was so often taught to edit. I was taught to edit my dialect. I was taught to edit my language, which in turn is editing my voice and editing myself. And to do that in my writing, over time, I realized it's just led to so much self-censorship. So I've been really working to be more daring in not editing and diminishing my authentic voice in that way. What about you, Elissa?
You know, I think, like Jen was saying, my definition of daring writing like shifts and expands so much the more I think about it. I had my students in a nonfiction form class this past semester for their final essay project, just work on an essay that was in some way risk-taking or daring formally for them. And for some, for some writers, that was the sort of like traditional narrative essay was, a big risk for them, as it would be for me if I were to try that. I think that for me, my own definition of daring writing is, I think writing that I'm doing that I feel like it might fail. Like it has a pretty good chance of failing in some way. I always have these elaborate formal setups. With my last book, White Magic, I had this essay that is, for me feels like a centerpiece of the book that's like 100 pages of these weird overlapping timelines. And it was just formally risk-taking in multiple ways for me. I was doing things with present tense, which I don't usually write in present tense anymore. And just like these various formal things. And I thought, this feels really fun. I really like doing this. I'm so invested in it. But it could be a complete failure. It could not work for anybody but me. And I could have spent, this whole summer or whenever it was working on this 100-page thing that I'm just going to have to cut from my book. And what a waste of time and what a waste of energy and what a disappointment. In the end, it was great. I mean, a lot of people, I don't want to say a lot of people, there are definitely readers who, felt that it didn't work for them. But I think many more readers saw what I wanted them to see in it. And I think that that's the kind of writing that I always am drawn toward, and right now have that sort of very nervous feeling around my work that I'm, doing this thing that I don't know if the form will work out that I'm trying to set up, whether it will just be, I don't know, whether it will fall flat or whether it'll do what I intend. And then there's, also my subject matter. I write about myself and I write about real life. And a lot of the time I've written about people in ways that are, pretty unflattering. Some, not everybody, just those who deserve it. And, those who acted carelessly with me. I put a lot of care into their portraits. And, and when I'm writing, I just tell myself this is just a draft. We'll see what happens. And, going through the whole process and keeping a lot of what I write that's real and true and might make people upset. That's, I think that feels pretty daring. It feels very scary. And I'm, working right now on something that I don't know whether I'll ever want this, what I'm writing about myself to be out there in the world. So that's another really risky thing for me.
Thank you. Yeah, I loved everything all of you guys said. All writing is daring. Writing, Elissa, like you said, writing that feels like it'll fail. I find that I'm constantly, when I mentor writers, I feel like I'm constantly telling them that they need to take a risk in their work, that they need to, make a situation occur that seems sort of inexplicable and then work to reconcile it. So it's really, really cool to hear, a writer reaffirm, what I'm saying, right? That you want to push your work to the brink of it almost collapsing, right? You really want to dare it to go as far as it can. And you hope it won't fall apart, but that doesn't always happen. And I think it's also good to say that in my experience, no writing is no writing equals nothing. I mean, like, you produce something, and if it fails, it's still a step in the right direction. I can't count how many failed stories I've written that have led me to something good. So it's not for nothing. So Ian, you started sort of in the conversation, started talking about how you dared yourself to write, and I'm curious what others, Jenn and Elissa, what you guys, and also Ian, you can still talk about this more too. You know, how do you dare yourself? How do you keep yourself going to write work that is transgressive, that is, you know, cutting against that capitalistic society, Jenn, that you had mentioned, right? That values a particular type of story. You know, the society that, you know, Ian, you know, made it seem like you had to reshape your voice and edit yourself in a particular way. You know, how do you keep going against that? I guess I'll call him Jenn. Jenn, okay.
Yeah, I was gonna go for it. Well, I think I really was interested in what Ian was saying about having a buffer. And something I realized reflecting on all the writing that I've done from, like, when I started writing nonfiction, I started when I was in grad school and working in an archive, and I was frustrated with scholarly writing. It was just not the form that felt really a home for me, but that was the writing that I was sort of being molded into creating. But I was working in this archive part-time, and I really was having these interesting interactions with the objects there and the stories they had to tell. So I started writing about the objects. And so the objects were kind of, I realize now, like a kind of buffer for me, a kind of way to avoid being like, I'm now writing nonfiction about my own life, or I'm now writing in my own personal voice or reflecting on my own experience. Instead, I could say, I'm writing about this object over here, which in a larger sense is kind of what my book ended up being. I'm writing about this other person's life, but then I'm really writing about myself. So then if I think about the writing I'm doing now, like, how do you continue to dare yourself, which is what Morgan was asking, like, I'm continuing to do like pretty insane amounts of research. And I think that the research is really ultimately a way to understand something more clearly about myself or what I'm trying to say, which is frustrating to learn. But like, I think that's part of my process. I think I'm able to take certain risks, especially formal risks on the page or risks with subject matter, writing about really difficult subjects, because I create some sort of distance between myself and what I perceive to be the subject at the time that I'm writing. And I don't know if that would be helpful for other people, but I imagine there are a lot of writers who do that same thing, who kind of try to push the focus away from themselves in the process of ultimately probably coming to some more self-understanding.
I think I'm trying to figure out how to answer this question. You know, I think because a lot of it feels compulsive for me, like why I'm driven to do it the way I do it. You know, maybe it's that I'm easily bored, or I don't want to be bored. I don't ever want to be bored. I want to be, you know, learning about different things, and my interests change so rapidly and so dramatically. And, you know, I just find so much delight in making connections that I've never made before, and I've never seen anyone make before. It just, you know, the writing process is how I process, like how I process my life and my circumstances. And, you know, I think I also like it feels like I'm being a little bit playful with my audience at this point, to, you know, to push into, you know, if I'm going to like have my readers like offer them 100-page essay about the stock market, I mean, I feel like that's a kind of a departure from what I've done before. And you know, I don't know if anybody's going to like it. So, but that feels, I don't know, there's not a lot of places I get adrenaline rushes anymore. Now that I've gotten older and my life has gotten a little bit I mean, it's mostly confined to this attic. This is where I spend most of my time. And so the ways I get my kicks, I guess, are just trying to see how far I can push my forms and my subject matter.
I love that. You don't want to be bored. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, so I've been thinking about that. I feel like it's the ongoing question. How can I dare myself? Um, when I think about like my life and my lived experience, so much of it is an experience of hybridity and liminality. And I think so often that such perspectives, like hybrid perspectives and perspectives from liminal spaces, are thought of as disempowered or indefinite. And Gloria Anzaldúa, who, when we met last week, I was loving on Gloria Anzaldúa. But her, among others, inspire me to see all of these identity borderlands as a gift, as a set of experiences and perspectives that grant a distinct voice. And so I think part of daring myself is to continue to use and amplify that voice. But it's hard because it's so vulnerable to do that. And but I think it matters for me to stay curious about what I have to say and how I might choose to say it, even when it's scary. And really, as I mentioned before, to turn off the self-censor. And importantly, to see all of that as necessary, as vital. I experience my writing as medicinal, like it's a part of what I do to stay mentally and emotionally healthy. And so taking those risks feels like a necessary part of just my well-being. I challenge myself to do it in my daily writing, but it's a struggle to stay kind of on the cutting edge of the risk,
Thank you. Yeah, I think it also gets tiring, I think, constantly having to, go to the page and take those risks, dare in certain ways. I always, when I feel comfortable when I'm writing, I know I'm on to something terrible. It's when I'm like in this like feral state that I know, okay, I'm on to something. When you're, I don't know, I think as a writer, it's so important to be unsettled. It's so important to not feel comfortable, cozy, unless you're Tom Clancy. And then I guess you can. But yeah, thank you all for those answers. Are fantastic.
I'm like just sitting in like a lot of deep appreciation. I didn't realize how quickly, I know we prepped for this, but I didn't realize how quickly we would get into the like talking immediately about vulnerability. And so Jen, when you like started us off by saying all writing is risk taking, and Ian, when you were like, I'm thinking about this and this is about vulnerability, and Elissa talking about failure, and it just makes me think, part of the main reason that I got back to writing in this particular way, like poetry, was because I wanted to push my vulnerability, because I'm a person that people share a lot of vulnerabilities with me, and I'm very bound in my vulnerability. So like I could write for myself, and that is not, but I wanted to be able to push myself to share that writing. That felt like the scariest thing ever. And I was like, why not? I'm like of a certain age now, why not? And so I just, so I actually I call all of the writing that I've been doing now just as my vulnerability project. And so I am like thoroughly riveted by this conversation. And so the next question that I'm now thinking about totally differently. And that's a question about what are the conditions. So we've talked about all of the ways that you all have been able to take risks in your writing and your publishing and be daring and push yourself. But What are some of the conditions that help you feel like you could be daring in your writing? And what conditions might new writers or writers that are new to publishing, particularly writers who inhabit identities that have been traditionally and historically marginalized? What kinds of conditions might need to exist for those writers? And I'm thinking about this differently because of what you said, Jenn, about like being able to write about something external first. Like that felt like a condition that you needed to set for yourself, at least in the beginning. So yeah, what are the conditions that help you feel like you could be daring in your writing? What are the conditions might new writers and folks who are new to publishing need to take more risks in their work?
I'll start. I think I'm thinking about this differently from when we talked last week. I don't remember what I was talking about then, but thinking back to my own, trajectory as a writer, I think it was when I really wasn't thinking that much about publication at all that I began to take the most risks. I was writing really safe stuff when I was in college and going into the beginning of my MFA right after. And then I was given permission by, my first grad school, one of my first semester grad school professors just showed us lots of stuff that was, like weird essay stuff. And I was a fiction writer at that point. And, it was just, it went such a long way to be shown models of things that were possible, that were different from what I'd seen before. And to be told that I could do it, that I should just try it out because it was possible for me. I had everything I needed. That went a long way for me. But, I think the other thing that was a really big revelation much later when I looked back is that once I was sending a lot of essays out to literary magazines and nobody would take them. Like so many rejections, dozens and dozens and dozens, maybe 100 rejections during grad school. I think that I was really freed up to take more risks once I just stopped thinking that publishing was going to be a possibility for me, and I still felt like really compelled to do it. And I think I still believed that someday somebody was going to take my book. But I think when I put so much distance between the writing process and the publication process, that became really good for me. And I put that in place deliberately after, people did start saying yes to my essays and, after someone did say yes to my book. It's a real feature of my process now is that I don't actually even really submit to literary magazines anymore. That for me is going to be part of the, once I have the whole book, then I'll think about that. But I want to really protect my process from thinking about, the ways that I'm going to be misunderstood, the ways I'm going to be rejected. Because as a Native woman writer, I still get like these really crushing and horrifying rejections that are not about the work, that are about my identity and the expectations for me. So I got to put that all like really far away. That's in a different room. This room is where I write and I just do like, I sit in my expertise and I remember that I know how to do this. No matter what anybody says, I know how to do this.
Thank you, Elissa. I hear that. Jenn, what conditions?
Yeah, I like, Elissa, what you were just saying about the physical space in which you write. The attic is where you sit in your expertise and know what you're doing. I feel like having a space devoted to writing has really been freeing to me in a certain way. The biggest obstacle for me for daring myself in my writing is just doing the writing at all instead of doing all of the other things that feel like they're for some reason more important. So like I went to grad school for something else. And it was only kind of at the end of that program that I decided I actually wanted to be a writer. And that process happened because of other spaces that I was able to be in and be surrounded by other writers and artists. So I went to Vermont Studio Center, which is a really wonderful residency. That was the first thing like that I had ever done, and was like surrounded by other writers who are still figuring their shit out, and some who were further along, and visual artists too. Being able to witness their practice, especially the visual artists, I think, and their process, suddenly made it feel like I could do that too. And I could, have the feeling of not being sure what I was doing, and just kind of feeling my way toward a form, toward a project, toward, the way I wanted something to look on the page. And so I think that freedom is, like I was saying at the beginning, like it's not something, at least in my life, it's not something I was taught was okay. That sort of aimlessness that you have to do research and to write, and that freedom, like that's just not something that was that I thought was available to me until I kind of figured out how to choose it, and then how to carve out the space and time, and then like viciously protect the space and time for the writing and for that freedom and for that space where you're not thinking about publication and you're not thinking about necessarily a specific audience or expectations or, God forbid, word count, like where you can just really, I guess, approach the project from your own point of view without those expectations. So those were some of the things that have helped me. Oh, there's my cat joining conversation.
Ian.
Yeah, Jen, is your cat as cool as Samaa's cat? I don't know. Elissa, you mentioned permission, and it just got me thinking back to being an undergrad, and again, thinking about poetic forms and learning, how to write in these poetic traditions. And I realized like I needed permission at that point to dare to crack those traditions. And so I started thinking about it as like hacking these forms, like you learn the code and then you hack them. So for me, to understand that there are these poetic traditions, sure, but that I don't owe anyone any allegiance to these traditions. And in fact, I could take this form and completely and purposely subvert it, to hack a classical form and turn it into an instrument for my own voice. But it helped me to have permission, from who in my mind was the authority on that, which was my professor back then. And but this is leading me to think about how one condition I think for me to be daring is to have something to push against. Whether it's, my internal voice that says, this is a tradition or this is an authority, you have to stick to this. Or, whether it's, something that frankly I'm pissed off about, in the world, or how I've been treated or mistreated. And then I'm also thinking about hybridity here, and how I feel that trying to give an empowered perspective to hybridity, my lived experience of hybridity and allowing myself to move toward that in writing, where I think so often we are trained and taught to move away from hybridity, so that, a piece of scholarly writing is scholarly writing and there is no space for creative writing in there. But I think, for me, I'm trying to push in that direction, to honor hybridity in that way.
Thank you all. Ian, really quickly, you used the phrase liminal perspectives, and someone was wondering if you could just tell us what you mean by that.
Sure. Yeah, I think about a liminal space as a threshold space. So, you know, a doorway, you know, is like an ultimate example for me of a liminal space. If I'm standing in the doorway here, am I in this room or am I in the hallway? I'm a little bit in both. And one of the things I think Gloria Anzaldúa in her work in Borderlands is really helping us to see is that when we have these liminal, these threshold perspectives, it can be disorienting and disempowering in some ways, but it also grants us this enhanced perspective. Because when I'm standing in that particular liminal space, that doorway there, I can see into this room. I can also see into the hallway. I have this enhanced perspective. And so when we think about that in terms of liminal identities and hybrid identities in that way, it's helpful to think about it in as an empowered, expansive perspective rather than one that is vague or indefinite or disempowered.
Thank you. So this is the last question before I turn to at least there are at least 2 questions in the chat. So we keep talking about risks and pushing against expectations, but where do these expectations come from? I think, Ian, you talked a little bit about self-imposed versus external expectations. And when we were, I'm going to drop this book in the chat, but when we were talking last week, and as you've done tonight, you've invoked Gloria Anzaldúa, whose work is phenomenal. And last week you talked about a quote in La Frontera where she talks about, where she asks questions: what's imposed, what's inherited, what's acquired? And let's, for this last question, let's turn those questions towards thinking about the expectations that you all have been talking about pushing against. So what are the expectations that are imposed? What expectations are inherited? And what expectations are acquired? Ian, can we start with you since you brought Anzaldúa here?
Sure. Sure. So when I think about those externally imposed expectations, you know, Elissa has talked a lot about, you know, wanting to like distance herself from those externally imposed expectations. So deciding to not think about writing for publication. And I think that's a beautiful way to do it. But what I've also been thinking about then is how we internalize, how I have internalized those externally imposed expectations. I certainly have. And one of the ways I see it show up is that I have so much writing that I've done, writing that I feel genuinely proud of. But I don't do a lot of work to try to publish my work. Like I really don't. And I think that a big part of that is because of the risk involved in that. And so I think this is a place where these externally imposed expectations about what an audience wants to see, what an audience will vibe with, what they will understand, what a publisher will want to publish, in turn affects how I feel about whether I want to put my work out there at all. And often what I've found then is that what I do decide to publish is like, because someone will write to me and say, you know, do you have something to publish, rather than me taking the risk and risking that rejection. And so it's unfortunate, I think, because of the ways that all of those externally imposed expectations I allow them to limit me. And so this is like a blurry line for me between what's imposed and, you know, what's inherited and what's acquired. It's all blurry there for me. But yeah, those are the main ones that come up for me when I'm thinking about the risks that I take and then don't take in terms of my writing.
Jenn.
Yeah, this one's tricky for me to think about without just using kind of the specific examples of my writing. But so like when I was writing my first book, I was really thinking a lot about the imposed expectations for what a biography should look like and what a conventional biography usually looks like, which is like a linear narrative that starts not maybe with the person's birth or maybe even further back with their ancestors and then moves all the way through their death and tries to kind of incorporate as much of their life as possible in a sort of very comfortable linear narrative. And I wanted to write about someone else's life that I felt the linear biographies that existed didn't really do justice to her experiences, in part because her experiences were those of a queer woman who had married a man and had relationships with women and divorced the man and married him again and left him again. Like this just did not really conform to linear narrative at all. And so I was really trying to push back against that and push back against the kind of completism that we expect from biography, where we're supposed to account for someone's entire life, acknowledging that that's impossible, and then really kind of being selective about the parts of Carson's life that I portrayed, the parts of my life that I portrayed, and how those were kind of in a rhythm or in contrast to one another, and kind of the sense that they made against one another on the page, while at the same time preserving a lot of white space and a lot of just space around the moments of her life that I was able to kind of capture through archival items or through some of the other research that I did. So I wanted there to be a sense of fragmentation, a sense of this is not a complete narrative. There are a lot of absences. There are a lot of missing pieces. And then when I think about now, the writing I'm doing now, I realize that the imposed or inherited or acquired, the external expectation I'm wrestling with is the expectation that someone will want to read about these subjects that are really difficult and sometimes really painful, histories that are really painful, subjects that we don't really like to talk about, like toxicity, like consumer capitalism, like things that we're kind of like, oh, I don't really want to address that in my life. That's what I'm trying to write about. And I realize as I'm writing about it that I get a little hung up on worrying, like, is anyone going to want to spend, 40 pages with me thinking about this? And so those are some of the I guess the expectations that I'm kind of struggling against right now in my writing.
I think there are so many expectations that non-native readers have brought to native readers writing, and I think that's changing because more of us are, being allowed to get into print, not for lack of trying in the past, were we not published as frequently as we are now. I still run into it, that somebody needs to be writing about, we want a native writer on our list. We want to publish work by native writers, we need diverse books, etc., but not that one, and I think a lot of us hear that. Lots of native writers I know have heard that. And so, I know that there are expectations. I'm kind of at a loss for what they are at this point, what my subject matter is supposed to be. But I know it's not supposed to be the things that I'm most interested in right now. I'm certainly not supposed to be writing about, Dogecoin or whatever. So, and that's certainly an imposed expectation, that I write things that are historically rooted and I don't know, wise, and most of all, that signal indigeneity in a certain way. And I think that's the thing that a lot of Native writers are still getting pushback from in book reviews and from lots of readers. You know, we have our ways of signaling or like not signaling, just enacting indigeneity. Like we are, if we're Indigenous, we're writing Native literature. And I think that there's still expectations brought to that are really, really, you know, I try not to think about them. And I think I've become pretty successful at not thinking about them because they are stifling, and it's a very hard thing, you know. So I work with students, I work with graduate students and undergrads. And, you know, of course, the grad students are thinking quite a bit about publication and books. And, you know, people are always trying to like nervously anticipating like what is going to be hot by the time I'm done writing this book. You know, is it possible to sell an essay collection? Do I need to be writing a memoir? Like, can I sell this? Can I sell that? And, you know, I've certainly learned that you can't time it. You can't anticipate what editors are going to want in a couple of years. But you also just can't really know what editors are going to want now. And there's just so much that goes into that I don't think it's useful for writers to think about that kind of thing. But another thing that's been a hard lesson for me is that I really, all I can do is write the best book that I can write, because sometimes it doesn't even matter. You know, I will be writing about, you know, the hot subject and, you know, writing in a form that people seem to be interested in reading, but there is just something about me and who I am that is like not connecting for some editors. And, you know, and after publication, some readers certainly. And like, again, that's all the stuff that I have to go, like, have this balance of like sort of not letting it in, but also pushing back against it because I'm kind of a brat that way. And so, you know, I think that there's, yeah, I will stop there.
Thank you, Elissa. I just, again, so much gratitude for all of you and the true things that you were saying. So I do want to, we started like about 5 minutes late. I'm hoping that folks are okay if we go 5 minutes over, as I do want to ask a couple of questions that came in. If you need to leave to go feed yourself or whatever, feel free to do that. As we're wrapping up, if you are so moved and compelled, please drop some appreciations and some gratitudes into the chat for our panelists. I'm grateful to those who have already been doing that as we've been going along. So just before you go, please do that. So I'm gonna combine these questions. So Leslie asked about anger, wondering if anger is essential to what we might call daring writing. So that's question one. If you want to answer that one, you can. And then Sarah asked, how did you find your voice as a writer? So those are two questions. You can answer one, both, none of them. So the first one again, is anger crucial to daring writing, and how did you find your voice as a writer? And I'll just open it up.
For me, anger is not crucial. I think that there are spaces where it gets let in, but you know, I think that the crucial thing for me is fascination and curiosity. Like curiosity really is it. I think that, you know, I'm not a particularly angry person. So, but I do think that the anger is very healthy, and when I get to build the form, I get to make the space for that anger, and I get to let it in as much as it needs to be there. And you know, and I don't think of anger as being like uncontrolled or uncontrollable or whatever. You know, I think it could be like very, very precise. And so, you know, I let that happen. What was the other question?
How did you find your voice as a writer?
That was really hard. I think, you know, for a while I was trying to like sound different sorts of ways. And I think, you know, I just developed it from practice and reading and writing and like talking and just continuing to be a human being. But I made a deliberate effort to get my writing voice to be closer to my speaking voice because I did not like the gap between them over the last few years. And I think, you know, I attribute just like confidence in the way I like express myself at this point, like feeling just more comfortable with who I am. But also Twitter, like just tweeting every day, as I was for a while until recently, just, you know, having those little tiny spaces of writing. I think Twitter is what really closed the gap for me and like got my writing voice like right in place, along with my speaking voice.
Anyone else? Again, no obligation. It's not compulsory to.
Yeah, I'll talk a little about anger. Like, I think that anger has been something that often drives me to write. Anger about a particular issue or particular topic, a particular, you know, person's life who's missing, you know, from the story. But the more I think about writing that's daring, the more I think that like you don't really get to choose your subject, or I don't feel like I get to choose my subject as a writer. I feel like I write what I'm compelled to write, and you know what I'm driven to write and what feels really important, what has a lot of heat. And for me, sometimes that's something I'm really pissed off about, and that I'm pissed off about enough that I'm like talking to my partner about it. I'm talking to anyone who will listen about this subject. And then that becomes something that I need to write about because I can't let it go. You know, I think that's actually something that is really helpful to my work in a certain way, and gives me kind of the energy and the motivation, the confidence or the bravery, right, to approach a subject because it's just something that I'm pissed off about, or I don't feel like people are listening to or understanding, and I just need to clarify it. And I think I found my voice by writing, you know, about these objects, like I said, about Carson McCullers, but I also found my voice in grad school by writing like a lot of really angry blog posts for the grad school like writing lab when I was pissed off about like student insurance or something. So I think that, you know, those two things go hand in hand for me, that I'm often like in the middle of a manifesto of some kind and just have to like get the like screed out there. And then obviously that becomes refined, but sometimes I do think there's that like kind of emotional heat is where my writing comes from a little bit. Oh, another cat.
Yeah, I'll just chime in to echo what both Elissa and Jenn have said. I don't think that anger is essential to daring writing, but I do think that, as I said before, it's helpful to have something to push against, and that doesn't always have to be something that that we're pissed off about. Anger is useful, right? Because anger, I think, is our psyche's way of telling us that, you know, yo, something is wrong here. You know, you have been wronged, you've been mistreated, something is happening that is not fair. And I think, you know, we can think of it as something that helps draw our attention. And, you know, I think it can be a fuel, but I don't find it essential to my writing. And yeah, I think in terms of finding my voice, I think I'll just say simply, it's been useful for me to think about how my voice can be who I am, which is kind of bucking tradition, but just I don't know. I think I'm always striving to underscore my own authenticity and my voice, and I feel like that's not as easy as it sounds. So it's a daily practice for me.
Thank you. Thank you all. Jefferson also asked some great questions, but unfortunately, we're not going to get to them, to those questions. Thank you all. Thank you to the ASL interpreters. Everyone is saying wonderful things in the panel and expressing a lot of joy that the interpreters are here with us. Taryn is coming back to close us
I'm
out.
just hopping on to thank you guys. You've been so generous and wise and wonderful, every single one of you, and I really appreciate it. I think our audience really appreciates it. Folks, if you want to unmute yourself and clap and cheer, now is the time. And if you're interested in watching any of this again or sharing it with somebody else, it'll be up on our Maine Writers and Publishers YouTube channel in the next week or two. But thanks, you guys have been wonderful. Really appreciate it.
Well done, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
Take
good night.
care. Good night. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you all.